Thank you very much for joining me today. I'm absolutely delighted to introduce our panel, which is Mitchell Gold, the co-founder of Mitchell Gold and Bob Williams, Kenji Yoshino, the Chief Justice Earl Warren Professor of Constitutional Law at the New York University School of Law, and Brent Gledhill, the Global Head of Investment Banking at William Blair. If you give them a warm round of applause. So this panel is about what is an advocate. And obviously our sort of subtitle today of Pride and Prejudice is the path to advocacy. Kenji, I'd like to start with you. You co-authored the report, which we're sort of using as a blueprint here, the when in Rome, embassy and advocate model. Since you wrote that, what has changed?
Yeah, so it's wonderful to be here, first of all, and the report came out a couple of years ago, so things have changed. I would say that the thing that has most dramatically changed is that you send out a model like this into the world, and then the world speaks back to you, so the pressure of application has made us think about the modeling differently. The first thing I'll say is that any given organization doesn't need to fit in one single bucket, but rather can find itself in many different buckets at the same time, depending on the geographies in which it operates. Another thing I think we've realized in interacting with the different models is to say that even with regard to things that we thought were kind of canon with regard to best practices are now experiencing sort of stress tests. And an example of that would be the self-ID programs that we articulated under the embassy model, which many organizations have adopted. The big thing that has happened on that front has not been the recent election, but rather the technological scandals with data privacy, with Facebook and other things. And I know, you very presciently have a panel on this or a breakout group on this later on, so I think that will be extremely helpful. And the final thing is that, very similar to the first, is that these models don't operate independently of each other, so that an organization, even in the same jurisdiction, might be operating under the when in Rome model, which is to say you just have to roll over and accept the country's norms, if the country's norms are more anti-gay than the organizations are. So you could do that at the kind of retail level, but nonetheless engage in the advocacy model at the wholesale level, right? So think about the companies in Uganda who said to their people, we're not sending you there because you're LGBT and you just can't be safe there, and obeying the law and the safety of our people is paramount. But at the same time, many of those organizations engaged in the lobbying that kept the more draconian death penalty provisions of the Ugandan law out of that legislation. Right? So you can actually operate in both buckets, even with regard to one region at one time.
Yes, that's fascinating. But Mitchell, when I looked up on your your Wikipedia page about the different causes that you sponsor, from LGBTQI to ovarian cancer to leukemia, I mean, it's a real wide variety of good works. And I wondered, as a businessman, how is it different being a businessman and an advocate?
Well, I think that everybody has a moral obligation to help other people. And when I look at the buckets of different businesses or industries that you can be in, I mean, politicians, they're out being an advocate for their cause all the time. Clergy are out being an advocate for their cause all the time. Why shouldn't business people do it also? And I think that we have a huge voice and opportunity. The community where our factory is in the South, we have a gay-straight alliance in the high school. In rural North Carolina, we have a gay-straight alliance. But the reality is the people in the community, because of things that I've said and done and others in the community, we've educated them. But beyond educating them, they also don't want to upset one of the largest employers and know that we stand for this. So I think, and what Salesforce did in North Carolina was incredible. It really made a statement to North Carolina when they had HB2 that we're not going to move into a state like yours. And Amazon recently said we're not going to move to a state that doesn't have LGBT protections.
Mm-hmm. What next could be done?
Well, I think the continuing talking about it and speaking about it loudly and clearly. I mean, as a business person, I believe after all the dust settles, the hugest problem we have is that religions teach that, quote unquote, homosexuality is a sin. And that very teaching it hurts people. It hurts 15-year-old kids to believe that they're broken. This is what drives young kids to have immense mental anguish, to think about suicide, and to even complete suicide. And I know this firsthand because that's how I felt as a kid. So we've got to speak out and get religions to understand. You know, when I hear other people say, well, you know, we're not out to change anybody's religion. I'm not out to change anybody's religion, but I am out to change people's religious teachings that are so extraordinarily harmful. And they're not just harmful to these young kids, but to the straight kids, they teach them that it's okay to think less of this person over here. To parents, they're saying to parents, your kid is broken. And this is why people go and vote for politicians that think that LGBT people are immoral. So I think we have an important, huge voice, and why shouldn't we use it?
Yeah. Brent, your path to advocacy is slightly more recent than these two. So could you tell us a little bit about that as well?
Sure. So let me start with just saying thanks to my two panelists for moving so many boulders for me and others. You've done so many things just to make the path easier. Not that it is where we want it to be yet, but I sincerely appreciate it. I think from my own personal experience, and I'd say that of my company, William Blair, I look at the path to advocacy for me, as you say, more recent. There's really the business side and there's the personal side, family side. On the business side, our clients essentially continued to grow and become more global, and it demanded that we simply think differently, bigger, greater breadth of perspectives, be more accepting, and actually be more open inside the firm about it. I think we probably thought it was the way to give dignity was to maybe be quiet, let everyone have their own personal space, not talk about it, not champion it. And instead, the last 5 years have really shown us that actually it's the other side that is the more empowering side, to basically be who you are, be your best self every day, come to work and actually be okay with your story. And the more that we've been able to build across our teams, incentive structures, talk about openly the idea of acceptance, we find that each one of our teams gain greater power from just simply a greater appreciation for each other, greater acceptance of each other, leads to better results, leads to greater revenue. So I think that on the business front was my first, probably more practical awakening to just how important it is to be more open and outward with the discussion, and that dignity does not mean let everyone stay in private and sort of quietly let them go. On the personal side, the real activation for me in advocacy is I'm blessed with an incredible child who is unbelievably courageous and took our family through a discussion. He was loved unquestionably through the entire discussion and ultimately transitioned. And as he did, we were brought into a new world that we had no exposure to really. And that was a world of prejudice that we wouldn't have thought existed, I guess, in the simple sense that my wife and I have tried to approach people as taking account of them and giving them love and believing that everybody has something to offer and trying to therefore approach each day like that. And I think as we went through our process, what we were very acutely aware of by the end was how difficult it is for families to even find services to just help them understand. If I'll say the millennial generation seems much more in tune to these things. Every friend that my son had, everyone at school, everyone was just fine with what was going on. They understood it. But if you're in my generation, and I'm 49 years old, it wasn't on the menu. Right? No one understands exactly what it means. There's a lot of questions. And back to the idea that privacy is dignity, no one wants to talk about it or ask. And so what my wife and I have tried to do over the last 2 years is really just try to become very active on everything that is the frontier of access to help, to service, to community, to just support everything from the LGBT community, where in Chicago there's the Center on Halsted, which is an incredible organization, helping people from millennials to seniors, in every aspect. It could be people who unfortunately can't stay at home anymore, or people who just generally need to talk to someone, and it's hard to find people exactly to talk to. Employment services for people who've been discriminated against, and then even connections as you continue to go in healthcare. And so, for me, that frontier plus our Children's Hospital Gender and Sex Development Program, which has been monumentally helpful and transformative for our family. When we first called it, had a 120-day wait. So again, things that wake you up to what's happening in America when you are asking, or a family member is asking the question of how can they be their best selves, how can they feel great every day? And you call the service that's actually available and you hear that you need to wait 4 months. You don't have 4 months. There's no 4 months there. There's debates as to whether you want to wake up the next day. So we need to fix that as a society. We need to make that more of a normal conversation and get away from man's binary definitions of things and allow the discussion to be about contentedness, happiness, and then therefore lead to acceptance and empowerment.
How difficult was it for you to get it on the menu, as you say?
I'll say that I'm fortunate that we've had a very open family discussion. If you ask my family, you'd find I used every word wrong, and probably from 20 years ago. The lexicon of glossary, there would be fork drops at our table as my kid would look at me. But that was part of the beauty. There was no doubt that, no doubt, and I hope our employees feel the same way. I try to give love, and so you love people, and you're coming from a good place. There's no judgment. To your point on religion, you can imagine, when you have a trans child. There's a lot of religious questions that are percolating. Dinner conversations on a Saturday evening where someone says, "Do you guys use pronouns at William Blair?" And I say, "Well, before you keep going, let me just let you know a little bit about myself here," right? And they feel very awkward, right? And again, you're not trying to have them feel awkward, but you're trying to give them an opportunity to feel how they want to feel and be who they want to be. Just also ask them for acceptance of who you are and what you're doing. And so, from that regard, I guess I'd say, very fortunate, but very activated and very, very hungry to not lose what has been unbelievably gained over these last 10 and 12 years on the human rights front and the civil rights front. We haven't needed much more than the last 2 years to maybe just have a small call to action, and now's the time to dig in.
Kenji, your day job is as a law professor. What do you think? How does being a lawyer make you think of advocacy differently?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think one of the things working in sort of at the intersection of civil rights and industry is to be really impressed, and I'm not just shining you on, at how much more than the floor set by the law businesses are doing, right? So we're in the realm of super compliance, and that's a wonderful, wonderful thing. But the baselines are nonetheless set by the law, and one of the things that worries me is that I think we've been relatively inattentive to how those baselines are shifting. So it was very, very easy to get businesses to sign on to the amicus brief for same-sex marriage in the Bergefell case, or the Windsor case before that, or the Hollingsworth case before that. The Masterpiece Cake Shop case, which is before the Supreme Court and will be decided, in a matter of weeks now, because the Supreme Court's end of term is approaching. Something that was a lot harder to get people to sign on to, precisely because of this notion of when there's a conflict between LGBT rights and religion, that the sort of basic decision makers thinking, well, I have religious minorities, and religious people of faith in my organization as much as I have LGBT individuals, so it looks like pitting employee against employee. So this is a much harder lift for me. And I just want to reinforce what Mitchell said, which is to say that I wouldn't say all religions, so I think that we need to be really careful in how we frame it, but the conflicts between religion and sexual orientation are so severe. And when we look at this particular case before the court, I do think that this is going to be a blockbuster case. That this case is as important to securing our continued sort of freedom and rights, in the United States as any civil rights statute, as any other case involving LGBT rights. So I'm a little concerned that there hasn't been more of a foment about this. I know people have done a lot, but if you actually look at the relative enthusiasm for this issue, as opposed to other issues like sodomy statutes or same-sex marriage, it's just not comparable. And the reason I think that it's so troubling is that, again, one of the professional deformations about being a lawyer is that you tell time differently. So for law, everything time is told is kind of beads on a string set by precedents, right? So I feel like we have a really four-square precedent for the Masterpiece Cake Shop case, and a case was decided in the 1960s, shortly after the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which was a barbecue case. And the barbecue owner in the so-called Piggy Park case said, I don't want to serve African Americans because of my religious convictions. And the courts just gave that the back of their hands all the way up the line, saying, this is a preposterous argument. To allow this would be to allow every individual to be a law unto himself or herself. And what's remarkable to me is that we're still having structurally the same debate where someone is saying, you know, I have a religious objection to serving LGBT individuals on the same terms, which is really what it boils down to, and that people are not seeing the callback to the earlier case. So I think that we really need to stand firmly on this. There is no religious right to discriminate. So, you know, whatever your faith is, it cannot include, you know, a right to discriminate, whether that's in our workplaces or whether that's more broadly in society. Yeah. So I guess to return to your question, how do I look at this differently as a lawyer? On the one hand, being incredibly grateful for the super compliant measures that everyone has implemented, you know, in this audience, but you know, also really hoping that we'll continue to keep an eye on this ball, because as Mitchell said, I'm talking very parochially about the United States, but this conversation is going to happen over and over and over and over again. It's happening in the UK right now in real time, but everywhere where gay rights is, there will be this religious rejoinder, and we need to be braced for that.
Absolutely.
And let me just be clear. I don't mean to imply that all religions need to stop teaching homosexuality as a sin. In fact, you know, Presbyterians no longer do it, Episcopalians don't, UCC Church, Reformed Judaism doesn't, Conservatives don't, and they should be celebrated. Those should be the voices. I'm always pushing my friends in the media, put them on TV to talk about these issues. Don't put Tony Perkins on from the Family Research Council. But you know, we've got a lot of religions that are changing, and it's proof that religious teachings do change.
Yeah. Exactly. I'd like to open the questions out to the floor, because I feel like this is, you know, a fantastic panel, and people will have lots to ask. If they don't, I still have some questions, so don't feel under pressure, just a little bit of pressure. So anyone who's got a question? Yes.
Hi, I was wondering if you have, maybe Brent in particular, have any tips for organizations who are welcoming employees who are in the middle of a transition to their organizations?
Yeah, I guess I'd start with maybe one of the things I mentioned before, which is I think you need to be very open and declarative about how it's acceptable, and overall there's a willingness for discussion. You know, when my wife and I went out to our friends and told everyone we could about our incredible son, what I found was a number of people from my organization came forward to me and, you know, did so one-on-one and sought discussion, sought help. And so in large ways, we can set a lot of programmatic policies, and we can certainly support things on the health curve and health services. But the first thing starts with a network of conversations and with just overall an ability to have someone you can talk to. And organizations, by definition, have so many different perspectives and opportunities. The more you can connect them, I think that's the first step to me to elevating the whole effort.
One over here.
Hi, Linda Leonard, Bristol Myers Squibb. In the last panel, one of the gentlemen talked about having an ally button that somebody had given him that, you know, he wears proudly, and it helps him engage in conversation. And we have something similar on our badges at work, but from time to time the conversation comes up that says, I would like to put something on my office door that says this is a safe space, so people feel free to be themselves, they can come in. And the conversation quickly turns to, it's not okay for any space not to be safe.
Right.
And therefore, we're not going to do that. So how do you balance sort of being an advocate, visibly an advocate, with we need to normalize this across the company?
Well, I'm wearing a button for the Tyler Clemente Foundation, and we stand firmly against all kinds of bullying, online, offline, in schools, in the workplace, and in faith communities. And I wear it because people often ask me what this beautiful button is. And I just, you know, said to me, could you imagine this country, the world, if people didn't bully, if people were really aware of what bullying means and the implications of it and the consequences of it? So I think, you know, by being forward and saying things like that, and Tyler Clemente Foundation actually has a project they call Day One, and they have it for workplace and any kind of business or organization. And it's really saying that everybody in that organization takes an upstander pledge, that people are aware that this is a place that's safe everywhere, including the bathrooms.
Kenji?
Yeah, just really quickly, you know, I think that it's largely a semantic issue, right, of saying, you know, you're worried about putting safe space up there because it implies that other places are not safe. So my instinctive reaction would be, why not put the ally sticker on your door, right? And by, say, an ally is in this space, and so you can actually, by implication, understand that this is safe, right? But also, I think there's a kind of social meaning aspect to it of, I really wonder how the LGBT individual who looks at the safe space sticker views it, right? I don't think, this is just my hunch, that most of us would say, oh, because this is a safe space and everything, I'm reminded of how unsafe the rest of the organization is. I think people would understand that it's not meant to be a literal statement, but rather a statement about how this is an even more, right, heightened haven, right, or a protective haven for whatever concerns you might want to raise as an LGBTQI individual.
Brent, do you want to add to that as well?
I think I appreciate the question. We've debated it inside ourselves across many offices. What people have in our firm is you have the ability to put a pride card or something onto your desk. You can identify yourself in that way. But we've probably tried to keep all spaces open almost to be anything, everything being safe. Mm-hmm. But the point is that as opposed to getting into you stand for these three things and you stand for these three things, essentially just try to be more open and accepting to everything from a standpoint of, again, creating discussion and space without declaring on the door, that something is specifically different than something else.
Any other questions? One just here. I think there's a microphone that will
over
come.
here.
Oh, sorry, you're
Okay,
first.
it's quite all right. I'm Jillian Weiss. I represent LGBTQ employees. And one of the phenomena that I've noticed is that what we call microaggressions occur in the workplace. So somebody comes out as transgender, somebody tells a colleague about a same-sex spouse, and there isn't anything particular that's said that's so terrible. And, but the hand isn't extended, and they start to notice colleagues turning away, and the work that they're getting is of lower quality or different or non-existent. They're not put into client-facing situations. Of course, by the time I get involved in this, it's really a little too late to address. But I guess my question is, in terms of the model of advocacy, how do you, as someone who's internal to a company and who's trying to make sure that people are receiving the same treatment as others despite their particular identities, you go forward to the ethics hotline, you say, these things are happening, I'm not getting the same work, and they say, well, unsubstantiated, no one said anything terrible to you, no one touched you. How do you address these lower level of disparate treatment issues so that it doesn't get to the point where I have to come in and address it from a legal point of view?
Thank you. Mitchell, do you want to start?
Well, I still have a relatively small company of only 1,000 employees. And one of the things that I do is make sure that people know in the organization that if they do come up against any kind of uncomfortable discrimination, that they can come and talk to me about it. In fact, recently, this past fall, we support the NAACP in North Carolina, and we supported their gala dinner, had a table, and I took several of our African-American employees, I don't want to say low-level, but entry-level customer service positions, different things, took them to this dinner, and during the course of it had the opportunity to say to them, just want to make sure that you understand that if you encounter anything that you feel you're being held back, you're not getting good work, you're not being promoted, come and talk to me about it privately. And I think part of leadership is my ability to listen to that person and then go ask questions. I don't run to somebody and say, somebody told me that you're discriminating, but I can ask them questions. I have a sign in my office that says lead by asking the right questions. But I can ask the right questions about that to somebody and say, how's so-and-so doing? Oh, she's not so good or whatever. Have you talked to her about that? Have we coached her? And I think it's leadership in an organization. You can definitely, and the other one thing I'd say is our HR vice president, I was just talking about this the other day, he's been our VP for 20 years. And he was in customer service, and when the job opened for human resources, I asked him to do it, and he said to me, I don't know anything about it. And I said, I can teach you the details about benefits and things like that, but what I want everybody in this organization to know is that I've appointed the most fair honorable person in the organization, and I want you to be an advocate for our employees, for our management. I want you to be an advocate for what's right, not automatically take the side of management. And people know that in the company, that that's what Dan is like.
I really love that. Lead by asking the right questions. That's a lovely thing to have on your door. Did you say?
I have a sign in my office.
That's fantastic. I'm sorry that we're coming right to the end of the session. Thank you so much for being with us today. We now have a series of workshops. So I'd like to, well, first of all, I'd like to start by thanking you all. Please, could we give a warm round of applause to our panelists?